Our next speaker comes from one of USA's most successful fly fishing destinations, a place where they early understood the importance of investigating the economic impact of fishing tourism and local angling. An international outlook and good example of how socioeconomic knowledge facilitates destination development. Please welcome to the stage Jamie Laatsch of the Henry's Fork Foundation.
Your Majesty, Minister, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jamie Laatsch. I'm the Communications Manager for the Henry's Fork Foundation, and I'm very grateful to be here today to tell you a little bit more about the socioeconomic research we conducted on the Henry's Fork and some of the key lessons we learned from the experience. I have to apologize in advance. I come from a town of about 1,000 people, so this size of a crowd is a bit overwhelming, so I am a bit nervous. You make up about a third of my town, so I'll do my best, but just appreciate the chance to be here. I'll also mention my co-author here, Dr. Cliff Knoll. He's a professor of economics at Weber State University, and he donated a great deal of his time to help with the analysis, and his expertise really is the methodology of economic value studies. My background is social science, but not so much the economic research, so I helped with the design of the survey instrument that we used to ask questions of people. So I'll do my best to stick to my expertise, but also share what we did in these studies. So I'll begin with a quick outline and history of the Henry's Fork fishery, talk about the Henry's Fork Foundation where I work, and give some of the background to why we thought an economic value study would be important, how we conducted the research, what we learned, but even more importantly, how we used what we learned, how our partners used that information, and what we learned from the experience. So just wanted to give a sense of where the Henry's Fork is, if you haven't been there or don't know. We are in the very northeasternmost corner of Idaho. And while I have this map up, I just want to remind, and I apologize if this is a repeat, if you already know all this, but I'll mention throughout the presentation the idea of federal versus state. So the land and waters in Idaho are managed by different levels, both the United States or federal level and the state or Idaho level. So my town of Ashton, like I said, only about 1,000 people live there. And it's the geographic center of the Henry's Forks watershed. We are known, or we say that we're known for being the world's largest seed potato producer, and that's about all we can claim. But the landscape I want to point out, you'll see in the very top corner of this photo, is essentially a desert, and it would be a desert if it weren't for irrigated agriculture. Pulling that water out of the river for farming and growing crops makes it look a lot greener than it actually would be otherwise. So Ashton, here we are in the middle. To our east, we have Grand Teton National Park, and to our northeast, Yellowstone National Park. You'll notice we are sort of a flat spot surrounded by mountains, so that agriculture is really concentrated right around the middle with mountains on most sides. So I wanted to mention quickly a little bit of what makes the Western United States unique. 28% of land in the United States is publicly owned, either by the United States government or by the states. And that makes up about 640 million acres. 85% of that 640 million is concentrated in those 11 most western states. For Idaho specifically, 60% of our state is, of the land mass of our state is publicly owned. So this is just a zoomed in look. Our river is sort of within that red circle. It begins up at Henry's Lake and goes 126 river miles downstream. But you'll notice the top part of our river flows mostly through public land, where the bottom part flows mostly through private land. So we do have to deal with both of those types of landowners when it comes to managing the water. Oh, I also wanted to mention, so there are federal land managers and state land managers. Across the federal sort of platform, there are a lot of consistent rules and regulations that apply. The states are in charge of things like access to the river, fishing, fisheries, and recreation, and water management. So that is done on a state-by-state basis. The Henry's Fork is fairly unique, and the state of Idaho is fairly unique that we have 50 points of public access on our river. A lot of public access with no limitations on how many people can use the river. That is one of the key reasons the Henry's Fork is so popular, because it is so easy to access. I'll also say the Henry's Fork is a working river, or it serves a lot of purposes. So the river flows through 3 reservoirs, 4 hydroelectric facilities, and contributes water through a whole series of canals to lots and lots of agriculture. Agriculture makes up about 95% of the water taken out of the river, water withdrawals. So a lot of access in the state of Idaho, and the water is very carefully managed. So this photo on the right is sort of a diagram of how the water managers track every drop of water as it flows through the system, who it belongs to, who's withdrawing it, and how it's being used, and then again how it returns in some cases to the river through seepage and other methods. I also wanted to mention here, in general, dams and hydropower are viewed fairly negatively in the conservation community, especially in western Idaho, where dams and hydropower have a negative impact on anadromous fish survival. So their fish passage is blocked by a lot of these hydropower facilities. But on the Henry's Fork, for us being a tailwater fishery, the part of our fishery just below the dam, in addition to the partnerships we've been able to build with irrigators and farmers, has actually benefited the quality of fishing and made it, in many cases, better than it would have been without a dam in place. So we're a bit unique in that sense as well. I think I just wanted a pretty picture, so I'll just leave that there for a minute. This is the Henry's Fork and one of our more popular access sites. You can see the mountains in the background. We're sort of a, like I said, sort of a flat spot with that backdrop. So the river and the fishery itself as a destination really became popular in the mid-1970s. Many people credit that to an article written by Ernest Weber in a national magazine in 1975, where he called the Henry's Fork the best dry fly fishery in America. So that really sparked a lot of interest, and we had a lot of people, especially from within the United States, coming to the Henry's Fork to visit and fly fish. Over the years, coming for experiences like this, maybe more for that. And then over the years, that sort of folklore continued to spread through word of mouth. People would say things like, earn your PhD in fly fishing, come to the Henry's Fork. So that really continued that momentum up till today as well. So we have all these anglers coming from across the United States and across the world to visit the Henry's Fork. We wanted to know a bit more about them and what they valued and how they perceived this river. So in 2008, and then again in 2014 and 2016, we conducted an angler attitude survey to get a better sense of what those anglers valued. In general, we found that they valued the aesthetic or visual qualities of the river, things like the insect hatches or scenery, or especially the world-class status that the river had over factors like number of fish they caught that day or the size of the fish they caught that day. We didn't believe them at first. We thought, you're just saying that, but we were able to compare to other data. So we did ask, please rate your fishing this year on a scale of 1 to 10. And then we're able to compare those ratings against things like fish population data from that year, insect population data. And we did find that the only factor that correlated with their satisfaction, their happiness with their fishing experience, was the amount of flow out of our nearby Island Park Dam. So if the flows were high and it disrupted the hatches, the insects, if they could see how high it was and maybe it was murky, that was the factor that really influenced whether or not they were happy with their fishing. And in general, when asked what they thought the cause of those high flows were, they pointed their finger at irrigation of the farmers every time. So we have this interesting relationship where fly fishermen value this visual experience. It's only really disrupted by high flows, and they blame farmers for those high flows. So that's sort of the context we've been working within. Where I work, the Henry's Fork Foundation was formed to fight a threat. Like many conservation nonprofits, I imagine, ours was the threat of 4 hydropower facilities proposed to be installed on a section of river that included Mesa Falls. This was in 1984. Luckily, a few years later, that was able to be stopped, but our group found a lot of other projects that we felt we could really contribute to, so they continued to work. And then into the early 1990s, they made a big shift away from this sort of fighting battles mentality to a more collaborative approach. So this photo on the left here is representative of the first meetings of the Henry's Fork Watershed Council. And this group was led, two main organizations lead this group, and it's the Irrigation District, or the group that represents the farmers, and us as the Henry's Fork Foundation representing the fishery. So this was sort of a one-of-a-kind partnership at the time where we led a group of, and quite a few agencies and organizations participated. As you can see, we've got the federal agencies, state government agencies, and other NGOs like the Nature Conservancy and Trout Unlimited, sort of bringing this group together to talk about best ways to manage the water and the resources. So as I sort of mentioned earlier, in the western United States, there's this sort of universal or classic clash between farming and fisheries, especially because they have such a strong interest in water. So bringing those two interests together to find common ground and ways to work together was really important. I just wanted to mention the Henry's Fork Foundation has a lot of other work. Collaboration is very important, but we also do fisheries health research, fish passage work, aquatic insect monitoring, water quality monitoring, youth education, and stream restoration work. We're really focused on projects that can benefit fisheries health and the fish populations. But more and more, we've learned the importance of this socioeconomic research, of understanding what anglers value, how they perceive the river, to help us prioritize our work, but also these economic value studies to have real concrete data that we can take to decision makers and policy makers to hopefully show the value that this river brings to our economy. So that is why we decided to conduct some economic value studies. I'll show here in a moment we've conducted 3 studies over the last 20 years, and I'll focus on the most recent effort that we've just recently completed and are analyzing now. The goal was just this hope to be taken more seriously by agriculture and the water managers that are able to make these decisions on water. We wanted to have a seat at the table, and we were hoping that this would give us some more value, something to bring. We also hope to leverage additional funds, whether it's to improve our fishing destination, for conservation projects, and this work was made possible by donations from non-governmental sources, so private family foundations in most parts, but we also had a lot of support and resources from government agencies and state agencies, whether it was through, they would loan us a truck or a vehicle, they would loan us staff time, and they would contribute in other ways. For the first study was conducted back in the late 1990s, led by Cliff Knoll, who helped on this most recent research. Then we had a study, data collected in 2004 by Dr. John Loomis. So in that case, we hired a university researcher to conduct the study for us. We helped with staff time and field work and things, but he did the majority of the analysis and the design. And then most recently in 2016 to 2018, we repeated that effort to see if the economic value had changed over time. We used a very similar approach. We redesigned the survey questions a little bit to suit our current needs. And HFF, where I work, our staff and staff from state agencies were the folks who went out in the field to ask these questions and to collect that data. Oh, I'll also mention, just for reference, the middle study done by Dr. John Loomis cost the foundation about $200,000 US. Because of the donation of time from Dr. Cliff Knoll on the analysis, this most recent study cost about $150,000 US. A little bit more on the methods. So like I mentioned, the goal was to get a sense of the economic value that the fishery, the benefit it brings to the local economy. And we surveyed Henry's Lake, which is one of the sources of the Henry's Fork, the Henry's Fork itself, and the Teton River in this most recent study. I'll focus on Henry's Lake and Henry's Fork just for the purpose of this talk, but as I mentioned, we provided the personnel in the field to intercept anglers at the end of their fishing day, get their contact information, and ask if they'd like to take a survey. They would get the choice of a mailback survey paper that they could fill out or an online survey that they would follow the link when they got home. We supplemented this with point counts. So the state agency hired a plane to fly at randomly selected times to count the number of anglers in the water, including anglers at their vehicles at the end of the day, during the prime part, the summer part of the season. And then on the either end, fall, winter, and spring, we supplemented this with vehicle counts, where we would go out in person and count vehicles. So as I mentioned, I'll share some of the preliminary results from our most recent study. We're finalizing some of that analysis, but I'll share some of our most interesting findings so far, and then compare it to that middle study done by John Loomis for more information. So there's two key things that we look at when doing these economic value studies. The first is economic impact, essentially the expenditures or the dollars that are spent because of fishing and contribute directly, whether it's through salaries or sales or income. The economic value is that willingness to pay, the maximum amount someone is willing to pay for their experience and their fishing experience. But I'll start with economic impact. To determine that impact, first we needed to know the angler use, or how many days, how many trips essentially are being taken for fishing on the Henry's Fork. So this number could include one angler fishing 8 different trips, but it's how many different trips are taken for use for fishing. We split it between the Henry's Fork and Henry's Lake, but the important number here is that for that 2016 to 2018 data, 138,000 angler trips were taken. Compare that to the 2004 data, 168,000 angler days or angler trips were taken. So this is an interesting finding at first for us because angler use has decreased. When you look closely, and I apologize, I don't have it broken down below, but Henry's Lake is where that decrease happens, and that's because there was a decline in the fishery in those intervening years. Trout populations decreased dramatically, and that's something the state agency is researching right now. It's also important to break down spending by category. So we wanted to know where anglers were spending their money. This is for the Henry's Fork, and you'll see the average per person spending per trip was about $230. Most of that is spent on things related to the fishing experience, fishing supplies, equipment rental, guide fees, paying a guide to take them out. However, on Henry's Lake, per person spending per trip was a bit lower at $115 per day. This is a different clientele. These are anglers who are a little bit more local, and majority of their spending is on things like gasoline to get there and groceries to supply their food for the day. So to get a sense of that economic impact, we just multiply the per person spending per trip by the number of trips we know were taken, and that's where we get our 30 million US dollar value of the impact, whether it's through income or sales, that direct contribution to the economy. Compare that to the Loomis data, and he found about 29 million. So it's a very similar number. So now for economic value, to capture willingness to pay, we randomized, it was the same question, but we had a blank for if fishing cost you X more dollars, would you still fish? And we randomized it so that each person got a different number. So some folks got $5 while some people got $100 or $500. As you can imagine, almost everyone said, sure, I'll fish if it's only $5 more. But very few people would say yes to $500 more. So we sort of plot that and find the median of these yes, no's, and where's the middle point. You take that willingness to pay number, subtract what they actually spent. So if you think if someone was willing to pay $100 for a day of fishing, but they only spent $60 to get there, there's some $40 of benefit remaining, and that's your consumer surplus. We don't have the data for that for our most current study yet, but just to show you from 2004, John Loomis calculated there was somewhere near $15 million of consumer surplus at our fishery. In theory, this is a value that we hope to capture somehow. You know, you'd think this is some additional value that we should be able to gain to improve the fishery, to benefit our destination. But the question is, how do we capture that? As a nonprofit, we don't really have a mechanism to motivate people to spend that extra money or to give that money back to the river. You know, we already asked for donations, so how do we rise that up and capture this extra 15 million? Some have said maybe the state agency should raise the cost of fishing licenses. But in the current climate in the US, that wouldn't be very popular for the government to do something like that. So we have to figure out how to potentially capture this potentially added benefit. So in addition and on top of that, you think of this question of, well, what if the fishing was better? What if an angler could catch twice as many trout? Or what if the trout that they caught were 25% larger? So essentially we asked folks, if you could catch twice as many trout, how many more trips would you take? And so we have that number of value per trip, and we can multiply from there. So again, this is from the John Loomis study in 2004, but he found the possibility of almost $50 million of additional consumer surplus on the Henry's Fork if fishing and fishery was improved. Just quickly wanted to mention the multiplier effect. So thinking about if a person spends $10 in a fly shop, and the fly shop is owned locally, a majority of that money is going to be earned by someone in the community, and it'll stay in the community. But if a person spends $10 on gasoline, much of that goes back to the producer or the transporter of the gasoline, so not as much stays in the community. So $1 spent on gasoline doesn't have the same multiplier effect as $1 spent in the fly shop, which is why breaking it down by those categories is so important. We get to multiply each of those categories by the impact it has on the local community. So overall, we did notice a lower use on Henry's Lake, which is expected because the fishery is in decline. But so far, total expenditure, that $30 million value, is fairly similar to the 2004 data, that $29 million value. The only difference being that when we calculate those multipliers, our 2016 to 2018 value will increase. But in general, we can think that angling and river recreation is worth somewhere between $30 and $60 million for the Henry's Fork. And that's encouraging for us. So how do we implement, or how do we take this value and put it to good use? Well, we've had a couple of different successes with this in recent years. The first is access site improvements, things like signs, facilities, and improving boat ramps. When we apply for funds to do this, or we help our local government apply for funds to improve these, having that explanation of our fishery is worth $30 million to this local economy really goes a long way to help us leverage those funds for the benefit of our fishery and these access points. We've also been able to purchase additional access and protect existing access thanks to this argument we can make for how much our fishery is worth. We have an example of state legislation. So the state of Idaho's legislative body proposed a bill last year that would threaten the status of a state park. It's called Harriman State Park, and our most popular reach of the river flows directly through it. So the risk was that if the park was under threat and had the possibility of disappearing, we didn't know what would happen to access on that side of the river. So a lot of local citizens and our partners wrote letters and contacted their legislators to explain how much the fishery was worth. Again, they used that $30 million value, explained how important it was to them, and we were able to prevent the bill from going through. It stopped in its tracks, which was great. Finally, bridge construction. So on the far corner here is Ora Bridge. It's a failing bridge, unfortunately, so they do need to replace it. But meetings with the contractor and the local government, where we were able to explain the value of the fishery, got us to a point where they were willing to push back their time schedule of in-river work. So they'll begin work on the sides and on the banks, but they agreed to push back work that happens in the water to the middle of July to avoid rainbow trout spawning and to protect the key part of the angling season. So that was a big victory for us as well, that they acknowledged the value and didn't want to disrupt the fishing season. So in addition to those benefits of benefiting access and facilities, of preventing potentially bad things from happening, or just having some success in getting our local government and other folks to see the value of the fishery, it's been nice to be able to establish that in people's minds as we are a productive part of this local economy. The downside being that our $30 million fisheries economy, it still doesn't stand up against an $8 billion agricultural economy. So we don't really want to take this perspective of us versus them. If we say versus or compare, we're talking about 30 million versus 8 billion. So we'll lose that battle every time. But if we position ourselves as an additive component, if we find common ground with these agriculture industries and other industries like hydropower, if we agree and realize that we all are invested in the health of this river, the amount of water in the river, we can find places where we have mutual goals and really work together to benefit the water resources. So that's the approach that we've really taken. A few examples, I mentioned the Henry's Fork Watershed Council, but we also have a group called the Drought Management Planning Committee. And that's us, that's the farming community, the federal managers who manage the dams, get together at different points throughout the year to discuss best ways to manage the reservoir and the dam outflows for the benefit of the river. And last year we saved about 14,000 acre feet of water because of that collaboration. So there's a lot of positive ways to look at that as well. So I'll just say economic value studies, for us, they weren't an instant solution. It wasn't, oh, you have to listen to us now, but it was a very powerful and effective tool in a larger suite of strategies when you add in collaboration and partnerships with other people. So I'll leave it at that, but a lot of people to thank. As I mentioned, Dr. Cliff Knoll for donating his time, a lot of our partners and local community foundations for their financial support, and the talented photographers, but also just thank you to you for your time and for having me here.